Hello again. Well, as the skies darken and I look out over thunderous skies over the Trent Valley, we've talked about the Normans and we're going to move on to the next clan. And they're very, very interesting because following the death of the last Norman king, Stephen, a new regime took the reins of power. And the 8 royals who followed on from him had their family origins in Anjou, France. So they were and still are referred to as the Angevin kings and queens. But this family also inherited an extremely famous nickname, which tends to be used more often. But whether you use that nickname, which I'll talk about in a moment, or the Angevins, both are correct. They both refer to the same family. Now, the founder of this new dynasty was a guy called Geoffrey of Anjou. And he had this habit of wearing a fresh sprig of the yellow broom on his clothing, usually his coat or his hat. And it became something of a family crest. And the Latin term for a sprig of broom is Plantagenista. And thus Geoffrey and his remarkable descendants were bestowed with a nickname that was soon adopted as a family name, Plantagenet. And it really is not more complicated than that. And this remarkable clan of 8 kings ruled England for the next 245 years. Between 1154, when we talked about the death of Stephen, and 1399, the cusp of a new century. And after England's terrible civil war and the difficult reign of King Stephen, it was a grandson of Henry I, actually, Henry II, who took the throne to become England's first Plantagenet monarch. And this man held power for 35 years between 1154 and 1189. He was a volatile man with an incredibly bad temper, very, very active, always on the go, always travelling, covered an enormous empire on both sides of the Channel. But during his reign, he was forced to go to war, not only against his own wife, but also against his sons who rebelled against him. And he died in 1154, a very disheartened and disillusioned man at Chinon in France. He was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Richard I, who is probably better remembered as Richard the Lionheart. And during his 10-year reign between 1189 and 1199, he spent only 6 months in England, which is less time than any monarch before or since. Quite simply, Richard used England as a treasure trove to fund his ambitious military campaigns and crusades abroad, and also to pay an enormous ransom for his release after he was captured by an enemy in Vienna. Remarkably, Richard I may well have been as tall as 6'6". He married, but he had no children. And thus, when he died from a wound incurred during a siege in France, he was succeeded by his younger brother, John. And so we come to a man who was famously cruel and immoral. And John is best known for his struggle against the barons and his forced submission to the document that we know as Magna Carta in 1215. Actually, John was in power for nearly 17 years between 1199 and 1216, when he died, probably from dysentery, at Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire, which brought to power John's youngest son, Henry III. And when he succeeded in 1216, he was only 9 years old. And understandably, his early reign was very difficult indeed. But He held on to power until 1272, and that's a remarkable period of 56 years, which was a record until the 18th century. Henry was more a man of the church than a man of the state, and he wasn't a particularly effective ruler. But what he did do was he had numerous fabulous churches, abbeys and cathedrals restored or built, including the Westminster Abbey that we know and the glorious Salisbury Cathedral, amongst many, many others. Whilst he may not have been the most dynamic of kings, his son, who succeeded him in 1272, was a very different proposition. His name was Edward I, known to history as Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots. He was a tall and a powerful warrior who took the ferocious defence of his realm into Wales and Scotland. Edward had experience of crusades to the Holy Land, and he sired a large number of legitimate children. He was a faithful man. His eldest was Edward of Carnarvon. And when this monarch died after a 35-year reign in 1307, it was Edward of Carnarvon who succeeded as Edward II. Now this is a particularly interesting man, because we know that he was the first bisexual king of England. He sired children, but he also spent much of his time with male favourites, to the complete exclusion of his wife, Isabella of France. Edward II was incompetent on the battlefield, and not surprisingly, in 1327, he was the first monarch in English history to be deposed. Now we know that Edward II was confined after his being deposed at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire for a short term, but his fate thereafter is both fascinating and unknown. We don't even know whether he died for a fact. But whatever happened in 1327, it was his young son, Edward III, who was chosen to replace him. Edward III was quite simply a remarkable man, and he was king for 50 years between 1327 and 1377. He became, arguably, the greatest medieval warrior king ever to sit on the country's throne. There are many things that we could say about Edward III, but let's be brief. In 1348, it was Edward III who witnessed the first devastating outbreaks of the Black Death in England. In that same year, he inaugurated the famous Order of the Garter, now the oldest order of chivalry in the world. In 1337, he led his country into what became known as the 100 Years' War against France. Now, he had a successful marriage, a very successful marriage, and huge numbers of children, including sons. And that became a problem when their descendants vied for power in the following century, the period that we know as the Wars of the Roses. But we'll come to that later on. Edward III died at the age of 65 in 1377, and he was succeeded by his grandson, Richard II, the last of our direct Plantagenet monarchs. Richard II came to the throne in 1399 when he was only 14 years old, and historically we know that the rules of minors are always very difficult and dangerous periods. His tenure was one of constant battle with nobles and the population, not helped by his personal tendency towards arrogance. He experienced the first popular revolt, known as the Peasants' Revolt, in English history, and after a troubled reign of 22 years, he became the second monarch to be deposed and almost certainly later murdered by starving. He was usurped by his own cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke, and it was the death of Richard II which brought closure to the immediate line of Plantagenet descendants. More on the line that followed another time. Thanks for your attention.